3 decades ago, scientists suspected that coffee might be causing cancer. In 1991, the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified coffee as possibly carcinogenic to humans. That was based on 2 lines of evidence: animal data, rodents studied in the lab, and also some human evidence where they take people with and without cancer and they look for associations with lifestyle factors. And in those studies, they found no link to breast cancer or colon cancer, but they found a possible link to bladder cancer. So that's what led to that suspicion. The problem with those studies is people already have cancer when you start studying them. So it creates a number of biases. We call those case control studies, and they're pretty weak. What you really want is a prospective study. So perspective means looking forward. So you start out with a large group of people without cancer drinking different amounts of coffee, and you follow them over 10, 20, 30 years, and you see how many people develop cancer among the non-drinkers, the moderate drinkers, the high drinkers, etc. And back in 1991, we had little to no prospective evidence on coffee and cancer. Now, that has changed in the meantime. Now we have lots of those studies. So what have we learned? Overall, there's a lower risk of cancer among coffee drinkers, and particularly high coffee drinkers. Newer studies in average an 18% reduction in all types of cancer combined. This link is strongest for 2 types of cancer. First, liver cancer. Risk of developing liver cancer is consistently lower among coffee drinkers. We see about a 15% lower risk per daily cup of coffee, and in total about a 50% lower risk in high consumers compared to low or non-consumers. The benefit seems about linear up to about 5 or 6 cups a day. The more coffee, the lower the risk, and after that it gets fuzzier. Why? Why would coffee reduce the risk of liver cancer? Well, coffee seems to be protective for a number of conditions like insulin resistance, inflammation, and liver fat. In fact, coffee seems pretty good for liver health in general. Coffee drinkers have a lower risk of liver fibrosis, cirrhosis, and a number of other problems. And the second type of cancer where this link is pretty strong is endometrial cancer. So, the endometrium is the superficial layer of the uterus. And endometrial cancer is consistently seen at lower levels in coffee drinkers. Similar to what we saw with liver, the risk is linear up to about 5 or 6 cups a day. For other common cancers, the effect is not as strong as for those 2. So colorectal cancer, for example, we either see no link, no effect with coffee, or a modest protective effect, a modest reduction of risk of colorectal cancer in coffee drinkers. How might coffee reduce the risk of colorectal cancer? Well, coffee seems to accelerate transit time in the intestine. Some people report that after drinking coffee, they have to rush to the bathroom. So, that might reduce the contact time between potential carcinogens in the feces, in the material inside the gut and the gut lining. Okay, these effects that we've seen so far, is that the caffeine in the coffee, or is it something else? It's not 100% clear. Some studies do show a protective effect of decaf. So there seems to be something else about coffee that is potentially protective, but there are also some studies that try to compare caffeinated coffee versus decaf and suggest that the effect of the caffeinated coffee is stronger as far as lower risk of cancer. So there might be a role for caffeine in there as well. Okay. Breast cancer, overall we see no significant effect either way of coffee. Although for specific groups of people, like for example post-menopausal women, there's a suggestion of a protective effect of coffee, and one proposed mechanism is that coffee is a source of phytoestrogens. These plant-derived estrogen-like molecules that work like estrogens in some tissues, but they work the opposite of estrogen in other tissues, and they're linked to lower risk of breast cancer in soy, for example. Then we have prostate cancer. And most studies, not all, but most studies suggest a protective effect as well. About a 9 to 10% lower risk of prostate cancer incidence, So risk of being diagnosed with prostate cancer, and mortality from prostate cancer in coffee drinkers. Comparing lowest to the highest intake. And then skin cancer like melanoma, for example. Some studies also suggest a protective effect there. And one potential mechanism is the antioxidant effect of coffee components. In fact, coffee is very high in some polyphenols, some plant compounds that have strong antioxidant effect. I've seen some statistics that coffee is the #1 source of antioxidants in the American diet, which is both a fun fact and a little bit of a depressing fact because Americans in general consume so few foods with antioxidants like fruits and vegetables that their #1 source ends up being coffee. And then for pancreatic cancer, no significant effect either way. For every other type of cancer, less common types, the data is inconclusive. We don't have strong enough data to say confidently one way or another. Okay. So overall, coffee, if anything, seems to have a protective effect on cancer. Now we have a couple of loose ends. We have that suggested link with bladder cancer from 1991, right? With those weaker human studies. So what's happened with that, with the prospective studies, with the newer studies? Also, lung cancer. The story gets more interesting there. And finally, there is one type of coffee that we can have that does have evidence suggesting a higher risk of cancer for that. So let's look at these issues one by one. Okay, link to bladder cancer. There are about 10 prospective studies looking at coffee and bladder cancer, and they generally find no link either way. And in fact, the IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, in 2016, went over the data again, this time with 1,000 studies on coffee and cancer, and they changed their tune. They no longer consider coffee possibly carcinogenic. And in fact, now the data suggests that it might actually be protective for some types of cancer. Okay. Does this mean that scientists are just flip-flopping, and 10 years from now, it will change again to possibly carcinogenic? Very unlikely. This type of change happens early in a field when we don't have much evidence and we have these suggested decrees. But as the data accumulates in a field, the level of confidence usually goes up. And so the more studies we have, the less likely it is that things do a complete 180. There are some exceptions where coffee is not recommended. Some people are hypersensitive to caffeine. Also, in pregnancy, there's a link to low birth weight and preterm birth. So, probably a good idea to moderate coffee or avoid coffee during pregnancy. Okay. What about lung cancer? The story there was really interesting because some early prospective lung studies suggested a link between coffee and a higher risk of lung cancer. But when scientists dug deeper and adjusted for things like smoking and BMI, which often go hand in hand with coffee, then that link completely disappeared. So it might be more a reflection of the cigarettes that people smoke while they're drinking coffee than the effect of coffee itself. Another controversy is acrylamide, which can be formed during the roasting of coffee. But scientists have measured this, and the levels of acrylamide in coffee are tiny. They're way below thresholds of concern. Now, there is one type of coffee or one preparation of coffee that is thought to be linked to a higher risk of cancer, and that's very hot coffee, specifically above 65 degrees Celsius. This may indeed raise the risk of cancer, specifically esophageal cancer, the esophagus, and possibly oral cancer, and that has to do with the damage to the cells in those tissues when the beverage is very hot. In fact, this link is not specific, it's not limited to coffee. Very hot drinks like tea or mate or other very hot drinks share that link. So, it's less about the coffee composition itself and more about the temperature of the coffee. So, you want to let your coffee cool for a second. It's going to save your tongue in the short run and your esophagus in the long run. Bye-bye.